Welcome to Renwick's Psychology Academy, where we explore how psychological research helps us understand human behaviour, thoughts and mental processes. In this section we're focusing on research methods, the scientific tools psychologists use to design studies, collect their data, analyse results and draw valid conclusions. Understanding research methods is essential as it allows you to evaluate evidence critically and appreciate how psychological knowledge is built. Experimental methods, AQA A-level psychology. So we'll start with the aims. So an aim is a general statement of what a study intends to investigate. It outlines the purpose of the research without making a specific prediction. For example, the aim of this experiment is to investigate the effects of sleep deprivation on memory performance. Hypotheses. A hypothesis is a testable statement about the relationship between variables. It states what the researcher expects to find, and there are two main types. One-tailed or directional predicts the effect. So, for example, participants who are sleep deprived will recall fewer words than participants who are not sleep deprived. And there's also a non-directional or two-tailed, which predicts a difference but not the direction. For example, there will be a difference in word recall between sleep deprived and non-sleep deprived participants. So the researchers must decide which type to use before collecting their data. Directional hypotheses are used when previous research clearly suggests an expected outcome. In terms of variables, the independent and dependent variables. So the independent variable is the variable that the researcher manipulates or changes, whereas the dependent variable is the variable that's measured. That represents the outcome. So for example, the IV is the amount of sleep, whether you're sleep deprived versus normal sleep, and the DV is the number of words recalled. Now, there are levels of the independent variable, and the independent variable must have at least two levels, which are the conditions being compared. For example, the IV, independent variable sleep, could have one level, say 4 hours sleep, or second level, 8 hours sleep. And in AQA exams, as a student, you should clearly be able to identify both the IV and its levels. One term you come across is operationalisation of variables. Operationalisation means defining variables in a way that makes them measurable and replicable. The independent variable is operationalised by clearly stating how it is manipulated. So, for example, sleep deprivation defined as 4 hours of sleep the night before testing. And the DV, the dependent variable, is operationalised by clearly stating how it is measured. For example, memory performance measured by the number of words correctly recalled from a 20-word list. So clear operationalisation improves the replicability and reliability, which are key features of scientific research. Conducting an experiment. So to conduct an experiment, the researchers decide on an aim, they formulate a suitable hypothesis, they identify and operationalise the IV and the DV, and then they choose an experimental design, independent groups, repeated measures or matched pairs. They try and control extraneous variables, collect and analyse data, and draw conclusions about cause and effect. Research issues in psychology, so in extraneous variables. Extraneous variables are any variable other than the IV that can affect the DV. If it isn't controlled, they can reduce the validity of the experiment. So, for example, participants' mood, noise levels, or differences in instructions could influence results. And when extraneous variables are systematically affects the results, it becomes a confounding variable. So if there's an extraneous variable that you haven't controlled for, it can confound the results. and therefore it makes it sort of impossible to conclude that the IV caused changes in the DV. Demand characteristics. So demand characteristics are cues in the experimental situation that suggest to participants how they are expected to behave, and participants may change their behaviour to fit with what they think the study is about. For example, by trying to help the researcher or behave unnaturally. The term called the screw you effect is used for people who try and mess up the experiment on purpose. And this threatens the internal validity because behaviour may not reflect natural responses. So strategies such as using deception or single blind designs can help to reduce demand characteristics. Investigator effects. Investigator effects occur when the researcher's behaviour unintentionally influences participants' responses. And this may happen through tone of voice, body language, or expectations about the outcome. Investigator effects reduce objectivity and internal validity. A double-blind procedure where neither the participant nor the researcher knows which condition is being used can help control investigator effects. Or randomization. So randomization refers to the use of chance in assigning participants to experimental conditions or allocating materials, and this helps control participant variables such as intelligence or motivation by spreading them evenly across conditions. Random allocation increases the likelihood that differences in the dependent variable are due to the independent variable rather than individual differences. Standardization. So standardization means keeping the procedures, the instructions, the materials, the timings the same for all the participants. This ensures that each participant experiences the experiment in exactly the same way. And standardization increases the reliability and internal validity by reducing the influence of extraneous variables. Written instructions and scripts are often used to help participants. Control groups. A control group is used as a baseline for comparison. Participants in the control group do not receive the experimental manipulation or receive a placebo instead. And that allows the researchers to determine whether changes in the DV are caused by the IV rather than other factors like time, expectation, or practice effects. Experimental designs. Experimental designs refers to how participants are allocated to the different conditions of the experiment. The three main experimental designs are independent groups, repeated measures, and matched pairs. Independent group design. So this is a design where different participants are used in each condition and the experiment, and each participant only takes part in one condition. So, for example, one group may experience a high noise condition, while a completely different group experiences a low noise condition. And the strengths of this are that there are no order effects because participants only take part once. And this can avoid problems like practice or fatigue effects that can impact the results. The downside or limitations is that participant variables may affect the findings. Individual differences, so things like intelligence, mood, personality, they may influence the DV rather than the IV. And the limitations is that more participants are needed, making this design less economical and sometimes harder to carry out. Repeated measures design. So this is where the same participants take part in all the conditions of the experiment. So for example, participants may complete a memory task in once in a silence condition and once with a background noise. And the strength of this design is that participant variables are controlled because the same people used in each condition, increasing internal validity. Another strength is that fewer participants are needed, making the design more economical. However, order effects may occur and performance may improve due to practice or worsen due to fatigue. And another limitation is that order effects must be controlled using what's called counterbalancing, which can complicate the procedure. For matched pairs, this is different participants used in each condition, but they're matched on key characteristics like age, IQ, or gender. So, for example, one participant in condition A may be matched with a participant of similar age and IQ in condition B. The strength is that the participant variables are reduced because participants are matched on relevant characteristics. And a further strength is that order effects are avoided because participants only take part in one condition. The limitation is that matching participants can be very time consuming and difficult, especially if many variables need to be matched. Another limitation is that matching can never be exact, so some individual differences may still affect the results. So just to conclude, each experimental design has strengths and weaknesses. Independent groups avoid order effects but suffer from participant variables. Repeated measures control participant variables but risk order effects. And matched pairs reduce both issues but are time consuming and difficult to implement. The choice of design depends on the aim of the study, practical considerations, and the need to control extraneous variables. Types of experiments in psychology. So we'll look at lab experiments. Lab experiments are conducted in highly controlled environments, such as a psychology lab. The researcher manipulates the IV and measures the effect on the DV while controlling extraneous variables. The strength is that its high level of control allows researchers to establish cause and effect. It's easy to replicate due to standardized procedures, and high internal validity. The weaknesses is that artificial setting and tasks reduce ecological validity. Participants may display demand characteristics, and behaviour may not reflect real life. Field experiments. These take place in real world settings. Get my words out. Such as schools, workplaces, or on the street. The independent variable is still manipulated by the researcher, but the setting is more natural. The strength is that higher ecological validity than labs, and participants are less likely to know they're being studied, which reduces demand characteristics. So therefore behaviour is more natural. Downside is there's less control over extraneous variables, and it's harder to replicate. Ethical issues can arise, such as lack of informed consent. For natural experiments, the IV is not manipulated by the researcher, but it occurs naturally. For example, institutionalization or brain injury. The researcher measures the effect on the DV, and the strengths are it's useful when it would be unethical or impractical to manipulate the IV. Often high ecological validity, and you can study real life events. The downside is there's no control over the IV, so cause and effect cannot be firmly established, and extraneous variables are difficult to control, often not replicable. Quasi-experiments involve pre-existing groups like males versus females, depressed versus non-depressed, so the IV is not randomly assigned. The strength of this is that it's useful for studying individual differences. It's often practical and ethical, and it can still identify associations between variables. The weaknesses is the lack of random allocation reduces internal validity. Confounding variables may explain results, and we cannot establish true cause and effect. So if a question asks you about cause and effect, lab experiments are strongest. If it asks you about real-life relevance, field or natural experiments are more appropriate. Sampling in psychological research. So sampling refers to the process of selecting participants from a target population. The aim is to obtain a representative sample, meaning the characteristics of the sample accurately reflect those of the target population, allowing findings to be generalized. So target population and representativeness. The target population is the group of people the researcher wants to draw conclusions about, such as A-level students or adults living in the UK. And a representative sample closely matches the target population in relevant characteristics, such as age, gender, ethnicity, or social class. The more representative the sample, the greater the external validity of the research. Random sampling. In random sampling, every member of the target population has an equal chance of being selected. This is often done using a random number generator, or simply picking names out of a hat. The strengths are it reduces researcher bias, increases representativeness, and it improves generalizability. The downside is it often impractical and time-consuming. It requires a complete list of the target population, and it still may not be fully representative by chance. Systematic sampling. So in systematic sampling, participants are selected at regular intervals from an ordered list, such as every 10th person. The strength of this is it's more practical than random sampling, reduces selection bias, and it's simple and efficient. Weaknesses: it can be biased if the list has a pattern and less random than true random sampling. Stratified. So stratified sampling involves dividing the target population into subgroups or stratas, such as age or gender, and sampling from each in proportion to their representation in the population. The strengths are it produces high representative samples, particularly useful when specific characteristics are important, and you get high external validity. The downside is it's time-consuming and complex, requires detailed population information, and it can be impractical in large populations. Opportunity sampling. In opportunity sampling, participants are selected based on availability and willingness to take part. The strengths are it's quick, easy, and inexpensive, commonly used in educational settings. And the weakness is it's high risk of sampling bias, low representativeness, and findings are often difficult to generalize. Voluntary sample, sometimes called self-selected. So voluntary sampling, participants actively choose to take part, often by responding to an advert. The strengths are it's ethical as participants willingly consent. It's practical and efficient. The downside is volunteer bias. Participants may share similar traits. So you get what's called a self-selected sample. They're often more motivated or educated, and that can reduce external validity. So summary for exams, so random and stratified sampling, high representativeness, opportunity and voluntary samples, more practical but they're biased. Sampling method directly affects generalization and validity. Ethical issues and ways of dealing with them. So psychological research must follow ethical guidelines to protect participants from harm and ensure that research is conducted responsibly. Ethical issues can arise at any stage of the design, conduct, and reporting of research. So key ethical issues in psychological research, the first one is informed consent. So this means that participants should be given sufficient information about a study so they can decide whether to take part. This includes the nature of the task, any risks, and their right to withdraw. Issue is that participants may not fully understand what they are consenting to, especially in complex or deceptive studies. Deception. So this deception occurs when the participants are deliberately misled about the aims, procedures, or outcomes of a study. And the issue is that deception can undermine trust and may cause distress if participants later feel embarrassed or manipulated. So protection from harm. Researchers must ensure that participants are not exposed to physical or psychological harm greater than that experienced in everyday life. The issue is that harm may include stress, anxiety, humiliation, loss of self-esteem, or physical discomfort. Privacy and confidentiality. So participants have the right to privacy, meaning they control what information about them is shared. And confidentiality means personal data should not be identifiable. The issue is that breaches of confidentiality may lead to embarrassment, stigma, or social consequences. The ways of dealing with ethical issues, the psychologists follow the British Psychological Society's Code of Ethics and Conduct, or the BPS, which provides clear guidelines for ethical research. So dealing with informed consent, participants should be given an information sheet explaining the study. Consent forms should be signed before participation. And when informed consent is not possible, like children say, presumptive consent may be obtained from a similar group. Dealing with deception. So deception should only be used if absolutely necessary. The study must not cause harm or significant distress. Participants must be fully debriefed afterwards with the true aims explained. And participants should be given the opportunity to withdraw their data after the debriefing. Dealing with protection from harm. So risk assessment should be carried out in advance. Participants must have the right to withdraw at any time without penalty. Researchers should monitor participants for signs of distress. Support or counselling should be offered if it is needed. Dealing with privacy and confidentiality. So personal data should be anonymised using numbers or pseudonyms. Data should be stored securely. Participants should be told how their data will be used. And observations in public places must not identify individuals. So to conclude, the ethical guidelines aim to balance the value of psychological research with the rights and welfare of the participants. And by following the BPS Code of Conduct, psychologists can conduct research that is both scientifically valid, ethically, and responsibly. Pilot studies. So a pilot study is a small-scale trial run of the research that's carried out before the main investigation. Its main aim is to identify and fix any problems with the research design, the materials, procedures, or measurements. Pilot studies help researchers check whether the instructions are clear and understandable, tasks are appropriate and not too easy or too difficult, check the equipment works, check the time limits are realistic, produce usable data, and by making adjustments after a pilot study, researchers can improve the validity and reliability of the main study and reduce the risk of wasting time or resources. However, the pilot studies may involve small, unrepresentative samples, meaning findings from the pilot itself cannot be generalized. Single-blind and double-blind procedures. So a single-blind procedure. So in a single-blind procedure, participants are not aware of which condition they're in, such as whether they are receiving a real treatment or a placebo. And that can help to reduce demand characteristics, where participants change their behaviour based on what they think the study is about. Placebo effects, where the participants show changes simply because they believe they are being treated. And single-blind designs improve internal validity of the experiment. Double-blind procedures. So in a double-blind procedure, neither the participants nor the researcher who interact with them know which condition the participants are in, and that reduces investigator effects, where the researchers may unconsciously influence participants through tone of voice, body language, or expectations, and bias in recordings or interpreting results. So double-blind procedures are especially important in drug trials and clinical research. Control groups and experimental conditions. So a control group is a group of participants that does not receive the experimental treatment. Instead, they may receive no treatment, a placebo, and the standard treatment currently used is this one. So the experimental group receives the independent variable or treatment being tested, and using a control group allows researchers to make comparisons between conditions, establish cause and effect relationships, ensure that any changes in the DV are due to the IV, not other factors. In well-designed experiments, participants are often randomly allocated to control or experimental conditions. That helps to reduce participant variables. So to summarise, the pilot studies improve the design and quality of research. Single-blind procedures reduce demand characteristics. Double-blind procedures reduce investigator bias. Control groups allow meaningful comparisons and strengthen conclusions. And together these features increase the scientific credibility of psychological research. Observational techniques. So observation is a research method used to systematically watch and record behaviour as it occurs. Psychologists use observations to study behaviour that may be difficult to investigate using experiments or self-report methods. Naturalistic and controlled observations. So naturalistic observation involves observing behaviour in a natural environment where the researcher does not manipulate variables. Examples include children on a playground or animals in the wild. Strength of this is that it's high ecological validity because behaviour is real and spontaneous. It's useful for studying behaviours that cannot be ethically manipulated. Downside is there's little control over extraneous variables. It's difficult to establish cause and effect, and behaviour may change if participants realise they're being observed. Controlled observations. So this is a controlled observation takes place in a controlled environment, such as a lab, where some variables may be manipulated or standardised. The strength of this is the greater control over extraneous variables, easier to replicate, and that increases reliability. The weakness is there's lower ecological validity in naturalistic observations, and participants may behave unnaturally due to the artificial setting. Covert and overt observations. So in a covert observation, participants are unaware that they are being observed, and the strength of this is it reduces demand characteristics and observer effects, and behaviour is more natural and valid. However, ethical issues such as lack of informed consent and potential invasion of privacy can cause issues. Overt observation is where participants know they're being observed. So the strength is ethical issues are reduced as informed consent can be obtained, easier to gain permission and approval. However, the downside is participants may change their behaviour, sometimes known as the Hawthorne effect, reduced validity due to social desirability, and participant and non-participant observations. So in a participant observation, the researcher joins the group being studied and becomes part of the situation. The strength of this is it gives greater insight and understanding of behaviour. Participants may behave more naturally once accustomed to the researcher. However, there could be a loss of objectivity and risk of researcher bias, and the ethical issues around deception and role confusion. A non-participant observation. This is where the researcher observes behaviour without becoming involved. So the strength of this is its greater objectivity and reduced researcher bias. It's easier to record behaviour in a systematic way. However, behaviour may be influenced by the presence of the observer and less depth of understanding compared to participant observation. So an evaluation of observational methods. So observations are valuable for studying real-life behaviour and often used when experiments are unethical or impractical. However, they are vulnerable to observer bias, where the researcher interprets behaviour subjectively. And to improve reliability, the psychologists use called behavioural categories, ensuring behaviours are clearly defined and recorded consistently. Inter-observer reliability can also be assessed by comparing observations from multiple researchers. Overall, the observational techniques are useful but must be carefully designed to balance validity, reliability, and ethical considerations. Observational design. Observational design refers to the way behaviour is recorded and measured during the observation. To ensure data is objective and reliable, psychologists carefully plan how behaviour will be defined, recorded, and sampled. So there's different ways of recording data. So number one is the behavioural categories. So behavioural categories are specific operationalised actions that observers record. So they must be objective, clearly defined, observable, and mutually exclusive. So, for example, in a study of playground behaviour, categories might include sharing, aggression, or solitary play. The pros and cons of this is that it increases objectivity and reliability. It allows for quantitative data collection. However, there's a risk of missing important behaviours if categories are poorly designed, and it may oversimplify complex human behaviour. Number two is the event sampling. So this involves recording every time a specific behaviour occurs. For example, counting how many times a child displays aggression during a lesson. This is useful for infrequent but important behaviours, and it can provide detailed frequency data. However, missing behaviours that occur outside the target event, and it's less suitable for continuous behaviour. Three is time sampling. So time sampling involves recording behaviour at fixed time intervals, such as every 30 seconds. So, for example, noting whether a child is on task every minute during a class. This makes it efficient and manageable, and it's useful for long observations, but behaviour can be missed between the intervals. And it can also reduce validity if behaviour fluctuates rapidly. So sampling techniques and observations. So continuous sampling, so all behaviour is recorded throughout the observation period. This produces the most complete data, it's high validity, but it is very time consuming and impractical with complex behaviours. Instantaneous sampling, so behaviour is recorded only at the end of each time interval, which makes it easy to use, and it's suitable for group behaviour, but it may not represent overall behaviour very accurately. So an overall evaluation of observation designs. So careful observation design improves reliability, objectivity, and replicability. Behaviour categories allow for statistical analysis. However, observations can lack ecological validity if they're conducted in artificial settings, and observer bias and interpretation can still affect data. Human behaviour is complex and may not fit neatly into categories. Self-report techniques. So self-report methods involve asking participants to provide information about their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. The two main self-report techniques used in psychology are questionnaires and interviews. So questionnaires are a written set of questions used to collect data from participants. They're commonly used because they allow large amounts of data to be gathered quickly and efficiently. Different types of questions, so open questions allow participants to respond in their own words. They produce rich, qualitative, detailed data and allow participants to explain their thoughts and feelings fully. The strength is its high validity due to depth of responses, but its downside is it's difficult to analyse and time-consuming, and responses can be irrelevant or unclear. Closed questions, they can provide a limited set of responses such as yes, no, or ratings on a Likert scale, like 0 to 7, and these produce quantitative data. The responses are easy to compare, and data is suitable for statistical analysis. So the strength is it's quick and easy to analyse. It's more reliable due to standardised responses, but limited detail can force participants into choices that do not reflect their views. The evaluation of questionnaires overall. So strengths are they can collect data from large samples, cost effective and quick. Anonymity reduces social desirability bias, where participants might lie in their answers. The downside is responses may be affected by social desirability bias. Participants may give inaccurate answers, misinterpretation of questions, which can reduce validity. Interviews. So interviews involve direct verbal questioning of participants. They allow researchers to explore attitudes and experiences in more depth than questionnaires. So structured interviews used fixed questions in a set order, similar to questionnaires but spoken. They produce mostly quantitative data, which makes them high reliability due to standardization, easy to replicate. However, they can be limited in depth and flexibility. Unstructured interviews, they have no sort of fixed questions and resemble a sort of guided conversation. They produce qualitative data and it allows exploration of unexpected topics. So the strength is its high validity due to rich data, and it's difficult to analyse and replicate as a criticism. Semi-structured interviews. These use a mixture of fixed questions and open discussion. They can produce both qualitative and quantitative data, so that you get a balance between reliability and validity, and it allows clarification of responses. However, interview bias may affect those responses. So the pros and cons of interviews. So the strengths are it allows clarification and probing. It can generate detailed, in-depth data, useful for sensitive topics. The downside is it's time-consuming, and the interviewer effects can influence responses, and you can also get social desirability bias. So questionnaires are efficient but shallow. Interviews are detailed but time-consuming. So always link method choice to research aims when you're evaluating questions. Self-report design. So self-report methods are used to gather information directly from participants about their thoughts, feelings, attitudes or behaviours. The two main self-report methods are questionnaires and interviews. So questionnaire designs, Likert scales. So Likert scales ask participants to indicate the extent to which they agree or disagree with a statement, usually on a scale 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. So it might say strongly agree to strongly disagree. The strengths are it produces quantitative data that's easy to analyse. It allow attitudes and opinions to be measured reliably. The downside is participants may show central tendency bias, so avoiding any extreme responses. And responses may be affected by social desirability bias, people answering questions how they think they should be answered. So using rating scales, you can ask participants to rate something on a numerical scale, like how anxious are you today on a scale of 1 to 7. The strength is it's simple and quick to complete. It's useful for measuring intensity or frequency. The downside is the scale points may be interpreted differently by different participants, and it lacks depth compared to open questions. Fixed choice options or fixed choice questions provide a limited set of responses such as yes, no or multiple choice. The strength of that is it's easy to code and analyse and reduces ambiguity in responses. The downside is it restricts participants' responses. It may force them to answer in a way that doesn't fully reflect their view. So when you're writing a good questionnaire, questions, so to improve the validity and reliability, questions should be carefully designed. Try to avoid jargon, Use clear, simple language appropriate to the target population. Avoid emotive language, so emotionally loaded words can bias responses. Avoid leading questions, so don't push them to answer a certain way. And avoid double-barreled questions, so only ask one thing at a time. And also avoid double negatives. They confuse participants and will reduce validity. So well-designed questions reduce response bias and increase the accuracy of the data being collected. Interview design. Interviews allow researchers to ask questions directly and clarify responses. So you can have an interview schedule, which is a prepared list of questions used to ensure standardization, particularly in structured and semi-structured interviews. And the benefit of this is it improves reliability. It ensures that all the participants are asked the same core questions. Standardized interviews, so all the participants are asked the same questions in the same order, using the same wording. This leads to high reliability and easy to compare responses. The downside is limited depth and flexibility and less opportunity to explore individual experiences. Group interviews, so more than one participant is interviewed at the same time. The strength of this is it's efficient and time-saving, and it can generate discussion and shared insights. The downside is you get social desirability bias that could increase, and dominant participants may influence others. The ethical issues in self-report design. So ethical considerations are essential when using questionnaires and interviews. So you need to make sure you get informed consent. Participants need to know what they're taking part in. Confidentiality, so responses should be anonymous and kept private. Psychological harm, so sensitive questions could cause distress. They're going to need a right to withdraw, so they must be free to stop at any time. And the researchers must follow the BPS Code of Ethics, ensuring that the participants are treated with respect and protected throughout the research process. So just to summarise, effective self-report design improves the validity, reliability and ethical quality of psychological research, and careful construction of questions, appropriate choice of scales and ethical awareness are essential for producing meaningful and trustworthy data. Correlations. So a correlation is a statistical technique used to measure the strength and direction of a relationship between two variables. So unlike experiments, correlations do not involve manipulation of variables. Instead, the researcher measures variables as they naturally occur. So there's different types of correlations. So you can have a positive correlation. As one variable increases, the other variable increases. So for example, as the number of hours revised increases, exam scores go up. You can have a negative correlation. As one variable increases, the other variable decreases. So for example, as stress levels increase, sleep duration decreases. Or you can have a zero correlation, or there's just no relationship between the variables. So for example, shoe size and intelligence. So the strength of a correlation is expressed using a correlation coefficient, which ranges on a scale from -1 to +1. So the -1 would mean that you've got a perfect negative correlation, whereas a +1 would mean you've got a perfect positive correlation, and a 0 would mean there's no relationship. The difference between correlations and experiments is control. So experiments involve manipulation of an IV and allow the researchers to establish cause and effect, as correlations only identify relationships and cannot determine causality. For example, a correlation between stress and depression does not show whether stress causes depression or depression causes stress, or whether a third variable like a life event causes both. This is known as the third variable problem. So the strengths of using correlations is that it's useful when manipulation is unethical or impractical. Correlations are valuable when variables cannot be manipulated, such as studying relationships between stress and mental health. There's high external validity. So So variables are often measured in real-world settings, making the findings more generalizable. The basis for future research, so correlations can highlight relationships that later studies can investigate using experimental methods. The downside is you can't establish cause and effect. And you've got the third variable problem again. And you've got the directionality problem. So it's often unclear which variable influences the other. So you can get some correlations may occur by chance and have no meaningful explanation, called spurious correlations. So to conclude, the correlations are a valuable research method in psychology, particularly when experimental manipulation is not possible. However, their inability to establish causality means they're best used alongside other methods rather than in isolation. Types of data in psychological research. So psychologists collect different types of data depending on the aims of the research and the method used. Understanding these data types helps researchers choose appropriate designs and evaluate findings effectively. So quantitative data, which is numerical data, can be counted or measured. It often involves scores, frequencies, percentages, or ratings. So, for example, you could have a test score, or a memory recall out of 20, or you could have a rating on a Likert scale for anxiety. And this allows for statistical analysis. It's easy to compare groups, and it's high reliability due to objectivity. It's useful for identifying patterns and cause and effect relationships. The downside is it lacks depth and detail. It can oversimplify complex behaviours. It doesn't capture subjective experience. If I said my anxiety is 9 out of 10, you've got to look beyond the data. Qualitative data is non-numerical and descriptive. It focuses on meanings, experiences and explanations, and it can include interview transcripts, open-ended questionnaire responses, case study notes, and the strength is its rich, detailed data and high validity as it reflects real experiences. It's also useful for exploring new or complex topics. The downside is it's difficult to analyse statistically and lower reliability due to subjectivity. It's also time-consuming to collect and analyse. So which is better, quantitative or qualitative? Neither type of data is inherently better. Quantitative data is better for testing hypotheses and identifying patterns, whereas qualitative data is better for understanding meanings and experiences. Things like phenomenology, understanding people's lived experiences. But many psychologists use mixed methods to gain both depth and objectivity. In terms of primary and secondary data, primary data is the data collected first-hand by the researcher for a specific study. For example, if you're running an experiment or conducting interviews or questionnaires or carrying out observations, and the strength of that is high control over variables. It's tailored to the researcher's aims, which means it's often higher validity. The downside is it's time-consuming and costly. You need ethical approval, and smaller samples may reduce generalizability. Secondary data is data collected by someone else, often for a different purpose. So, for example, published research articles, government statistics, psychological databases. This means it's quick and cost-effective. It allows access to large data sets. It's useful for comparisons over time. The downside is it can be outdated, not designed for the current research question, and less control over methodology and variables. A meta-analysis is known as the gold standard, which is a statistical technique that combines results from multiple studies to identify overall trends. Key concepts really are the effect size, which measures the strength of a relationship or difference, publication bias, so studies with significant results are more likely to be published, and you can also have the file drawer problem, where studies with null results may not be published, which skews conclusions. So overall, the strengths are it increases statistical power, it identifies consistent effects across studies, and reduces influence of single study bias. The downside is quality depends on included studies. Publication bias can distort findings and combine studies with different methods. So to summarise, quantitative data is numerical, objective and reliable. Qualitative data is rich, detailed, descriptive data. Primary data is collected by the researcher, or secondary data is already existing, and the meta-analysis helps to identify broader patterns that can be affected by bias. Measures of central tendency and dispersion. So in psychology, researchers often collect numerical data, and to make sense of this data, measures of central tendency and dispersion are used to describe patterns within the data set. So measures of central tendency describe the average or sort of typical scores in a data set, and we use the mean, which is the average calculated by adding up all the scores and dividing by the total number of scores. The advantages of this is that it uses all the data values, and it's the most sensitive measure, so reflects small changes in scores. The downside is it can be easily distorted by extreme values known as outliers. The median is the middle score when all values are placed in order from lowest to highest. The strength is it's not affected by extreme scores, and it's useful for skewed data. The downside is it does not use all the data values, therefore it's less sensitive to changes in the data. The mode is the most frequent occurring score in a data set. This can be used with nominal data, and it's easy to identify. The downside is it may not represent the data well, and there may be more than one mode or none at all. Measures of dispersion describe how spread out the data is. So you've got the range, which is calculated by subtracting the lowest score from the highest score, which means it's very easy to calculate, gives a quick indication of the spread. The downside is it only uses two values, and it can be heavily influenced by outliers. The standard deviation measures how much scores deviate from the average. So the strength of this is that it uses all data values, provides a detailed measure of variability. A small standard deviation means scores are clustered close to the average. A large standard deviation means the scores are widely spread. The weaknesses is that more complex to calculate, it can be difficult to interpret without context. So just to summarise, the mean, mode and median describe the average score. The range and standard deviation describe variability, and psychologists often use mean and standard deviation together to give a full picture of the data. The choice of measure depends on the type of data and the presence of outliers. So presentation of quantitative data. So quantitative data refers to numerical data that can be measured, counted and statistically analysed. And psychologists present quantitative data visually to identify patterns, trends and relationships more easily. This can include tables, which present numerical data in an organised way using rows and columns. They're useful for showing raw data, totals and calculated values such as means, standard deviations, and tables should always have clear titles, be labelled and units of measurement. Bar charts are used for discrete data where the categories are separate and do not overlap. The bars are separated by gaps to show that each category is distinct. And bar charts are commonly used to display means, frequencies or percentages for different conditions or groups. Histograms, these are used for continuous data where values fall along a scale, for example time, height or reaction time. So unlike bar charts, the bars touch, showing continuity of data. And histograms are useful for identifying the shape of a distribution, such as whether it is normal or skewed. Scattergrams are used for displaying correlational data. So each point represents a pair of scores from the two variables, and the pattern of points shows the direction and strength of the correlation. So positive correlation, as one variable increases, the other increases. Negative correlation, as one variable increases, the other decreases, or for no correlation, there's no pattern. Distribution, so normal distribution is a symmetrical bell-shaped curve with the mean, mode and median are the same value. Most scores cluster around the middle with fewer extreme scores at either end. This pattern is common in psychological characteristics such as intelligence, where the average is around 100. You can get skewed distributions. So a positive skewed distribution, the tail is on the right hand side. Most scores are low with a few high outliers. The average is higher than the median. It's pulled by extreme scores. As a negative skew, the tail is on the left hand side and most scores are high with a few low outliers. The mean is lower than the median, again due to the extreme values. So why does this matter? Well, presenting quantitative data visually helps psychologists to identify patterns and trends, compare conditions or groups, detect any outliers, and helps to communicate findings clearly and efficiently. So statistical tests help us to understand results and check whether they're due to chance or not. The sign test, for example, is a non-parametric method used to compare paired data by analysing the direction of differences. Probability measures the likelihood an event will occur, while the critical value marks the threshold for statistical significance in hypothesis testing. The sign test is the test that you need to know how to calculate, really, so make sure that you understand how to go through that one. I do have a video on that as well, if you want to search for that on my YouTube. So peer review in psychological research. So this is the process by which psychological research is assessed by experts in the same field before it's published. Its main purpose is to ensure that research is of high quality, scientifically valid and ethically sound. Reviewers evaluate the aims, method, analysis, conclusions, ethics of the study, and they can, accept it or reject it or ask you to make amendments, etc. And this helps prevent flawed research from being published, and it improves the reliability of psychological knowledge. Peer reviews also play a key role in allocating funding for research. Funding bodies rely on peer-reviewed proposals to decide which projects are worth investing in, ensuring that the limited resources are directed towards credible and worthwhile research. So the strength of a peer review is that it improves the quality and credibility of research by identifying errors, methodological weaknesses, and any unethical practices before publication. However, the peer review is not without limitations. The process can be biased, as reviewers may favour research that supports their own views or established theories. This can disadvantage innovative or controversial ideas. There's also concerns about publication bias, where studies with significant or positive findings are more likely to be published than those with null results. This can create the file drawer effect, where non-significant findings remain unpublished, distorting the overall evidence base. Also, the anonymity of reviewers can be a problem. While it encourages honest critique, it may also allow unfair or over-harsh judgments. So peer review can also be slow and expensive, delaying the dissemination of important findings. The psychological research and the economy. So psychological research has significant implications for the economy, particularly in healthcare, education and criminal justice. So, for example, research into eyewitness testimonies, influence police procedures, legal policy, helping to reduce miscarriages of justice and associated financial costs. Improved interviewing techniques such as the cognitive interview can save time and resources in the criminal justice system. Mental health research has major economic implications. So in England alone, mental health problems are estimated to cost the economy over 110 billion a year due to healthcare costs, lost productivity and unemployment. Research into things like CBT or SSRI medication has informed NHS guidelines, allowing more cost-effective and evidence-based care. CBT in particular is often favoured as a short-term structured therapy that reduces long-term healthcare costs. So overall, psychological research contributes to the economy efficiently by improving well-being, increasing productivity, reducing crime, and informing public policy. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation on research methods. We appreciate your time and interest in engaging with our educational content. So you can join Renwick Psychology Academy to deepen your understanding and enhance your psychology studies. So if you stay connected by subscribing to our YouTube channel for regular updates and valuable psychology resources.